This is your sixth lecture for Philosophy 100, our Introduction to Philosophy. And in this lecture, we're looking at Plato's star pupil, Aristotle. And if Plato is not the most influential person in the history of philosophy, then his student Aristotle would be.
It really is quite amazing if you think about it that the two most important philosophers in the history of Western civilization had a teacher-student relationship. Aristotle had a great deal of respect for his teacher, Plato, even erecting a memorial monument to Plato after Plato's death, but he did have some very strong disagreements with his teacher. Just as Plato taught his students at the academy, we see that we have an institution called the Lyceum where Aristotle teaches. Aristotle actually at one point was the teacher to Alexander the Great, who ruled over an enormous Greek empire. The primary difference we have as far as the vision being taught at the academy and the Lyceum between Aristotle and Plato is that we saw that Plato had a dualistic view of ontology or metaphysics, and we see Aristotle strongly against this, going to a monistic view of ontology, and I will be unpacking that a bit more. We do see that these two philosophers represent the primary divide that has continued throughout Western philosophy over the past 2,400 years. We saw Plato looking inward to the idea of the forms or concepts representing the greatest truth or the greatest good. And we will see Aristotle actually looking outward to the world of observation and even some of our earliest forms of what we today would call the hard sciences to learn about truth through observation of the natural world. Now, the main point of contention that Aristotle had with his teacher is that he could not accept Plato's idea that there were the actual independent existence of these capital F forms, and that was of paramount or most greatest importance for Plato was this realm of the invisible form, that it represents the perfect or the ideal. Aristotle, however, said that forms with a lowercase f only existed in an interdependent relationship with matter. The only way that any form can really come into existence is when it is joined together with matter. Now, just because Plato's forms could be conceptualized, Aristotle argued this does not mean that just because you can imagine them or just because you can think about them, that doesn't give them their own ontological status, their own status of existing. As we turn to some more specific details of Aristotle's ontology, and again, ontology is a really important word for introduction to philosophy, and this is the study of what actually exists, or the study of being, that which actually is. Aristotle presents the idea that the things that actually exist, that there are several things that can be true about them, not just one thing can be true, but some of the truths are more important than others. The great example is given in your textbook that you could have three architects working on a building, and they're laying bricks, and so you ask the first builder what he's doing, and he says, well, I'm laying this single brick. And perhaps you ask the next bricklayer what he's doing. He says, well, I'm working on building an archway here. And then you ask the next builder, and he would say that he's actually working on building a cathedral. Now, all three are true. The first one is laying a singular brick, but that's with the purpose of the greater truth of building the archway, which is the purpose of even a greater truth than that of building the entire building, the cathedral. So we see all of these things are true, but some of them have greater relevance than others to seeing the big picture. Aristotle spoke of four causes. We've already somewhat looked at the first two on the previous slide. There is the material cause. This is the actual matter that would comprise something. But then that matter has to be shaped into a particular form, and therefore we also have the formal cause. And so this is what we meant on the previous slide when we say that the forms are actually interdependent with matter to exist. The two must come together. An example here to help you understand, say you have a blob of Play-Doh, okay, and the Play-Doh is the matter, but it really hasn't been shaped into any particular form. And so let's say you take the Play-Doh and you use it to put the Play-Doh in the form of some animal or maybe some building. And so now the Play-Doh, the material cause, has been given its form, whatever you've shaped it into. Okay, we also have what's called the efficient cause, and Aristotle argued that within all things that exist, there is actually something that is driving them, something that is a catalyst to bring them to their place of maturation or their place of full growth. A really important term that you have for Aristotle is entelechy, and entelechy is that drive or that thing that is inherent within anything that exists that drives it to become what it is intended to be. The seed has an entelechy that drives it to grow into a full-grown plant. The infant human being has an entelechy within him or her that drives her to grow up into a mature adult. And so when we finally come to this last stage of full development, whatever one was intended to be, whether that's a thing or whatever, or maybe what an event was intended to bring about, that is called the final cause. Aristotle also speaks a great deal of the soul or the psyche, the self of the human being, and he presents what he considers most unique about the soul of humanity. As he looks at living things, he sees that a mosquito has what he calls the lowest level of souls, the nutritive soul, which means that the mosquito, the soul of a mosquito, the self of a mosquito, can only exist to take in nutrition or to take in whatever is needed for its physical body to grow and stay alive. We then have Aristotle moving to the sentient level of the soul, and maybe you would think of your family dog here. Yes, the family dog, like the mosquito, can take in nutrition to grow and remain alive, but also the family dog has senses that it can touch, taste, smell, and so also we have the family dog able to take in the world around him or her. But only human beings, according to Aristotle, have not only the nutritive and the sentient soul, but they also have the rational level of the soul, and that means being able to analyze and try to interpret the things that you observe and take in around you. Again, here with Aristotle, the main thing with the rational soul is that it can turn outward, observe the outward world, the natural world, observe those things, analyze them, and try to make a greater sense of purpose of those things, whereas we had Plato turning inward to his realm of the forms. And so with this basic introduction to the ontology of Aristotle, this now brings us to the unique ethical vision that Aristotle presents in a book that was written in honor of his son. Before looking at Nicomachean Ethics, this is a lecture that I'm going to give you one of those kind of silly pop culture bonus quiz questions. So if you email me with an answer to this question, I'll give you 10 points on your most recent reading quiz. Here we're looking at the philosopher Aristotle. Well, there just so happens to be a recently retired, very, very famous basketball player who gave himself the nickname the Big Aristotle. Okay, so if you can email me the name of the basketball player that gave himself the nickname the Big Aristotle, that'll be worth 10 points. Okay, now on to ethics. The inherent drive, remember the entelechy of the rational soul, is intended to bring us to the highest state of virtue, which is eudaimonia. And eudaimonia can be translated as natural happiness, but it's really more than that. It's overall well-being of the human person. Now, Aristotle does not share Plato's rather static, standstill view of reality, but instead has a much more dynamic view in which the entirety of the natural world is being driven forward, being catalyzed towards some intentional or purposeful end or goal, a full stage of maturation. This type of thinking is called teleological thinking. Telos is the Greek word for the end or the finality. And so we see that Aristotle has a view of reality always moving in a direction to achieve some desired end, some sort of particular finish line. And again, that's called teleological thinking. Now, Aristotle himself is not a religious man, but I think you can probably see with this teleological thinking that it's had enormous influence on the two largest religions in the world today, Christianity and Islam. This idea of the story of humankind moving toward a particular outcome, and that's certainly stressed within both Christianity and Islam, even though Aristotle himself was not an adherent to any particular religion of believing in the supernatural. For Aristotle, the key to arriving at this natural happiness, this state of well-being, eudaimonia, was moderation and balance. The term in Greek that's used here is sophrosyne. To reach that state of balance, you need to practice sophrosyne, which means to be very moderate. Don't go to excess, but also don't deprive yourself. And so, but when we see Aristotle discussing the virtues, we see the virtue is always coming in between two particular vices that represent deprivation or lack, and on the other hand, excess. There's a great chart toward the end of the chapter on Aristotle in your book that gives you several examples of these. But it's almost as if you could picture a seesaw, and when you have the seesaw falling to the ground on one side, you have a particular vice. Let's use the example of cowardice here, that you're too afraid to do anything, so that would be a vice. And then if you swing the seesaw all the way to the other end, you're going to see a vice of excess, and this is the word your author uses, is foolhardiness, that you're so sure of being able to get away with things that you make foolish decisions, and so that's the opposite of cowardice. But then if you take that seesaw and you balance it, we see right in the middle would be the virtue of courage. One other example, let's take the virtue of humility. If you take the seesaw and you swing it all the way down to the side of deprivation, this means that you have a very poor view of your self, that you're letting others treat you like a doormat. You don't stand up for yourself at all. Then you swing it to the other side and you would have arrogance, that you think way too highly of yourself. But there, somewhere in the middle between those two, would be the virtue of humility. So remember for Aristotle that the virtue is always a balance between two different vices on either side.